All right, it is time for class number 3, block number 2 of our O Tannenbaum sew-along. My daughter and I have owned and operated a busy quilt shop in Washington State for over 20 years. We have a retreat center, an active YouTube channel, and a large pattern line featuring our creations. My 2 sons work on machines. One daughter-in-law is our videographer and the other is a long-arm quilter. We are a family that love each other, we laugh together, and every once in a while we get some work done. We have a crew that are saints for their efforts at keeping us on track. Thanks for joining us on our wild ride. So hopefully you're kind of keeping up, and if you are, you made all of your half square triangles for last week, and this week we're going to do basically the same thing. I'm sure you've looked ahead in your pattern. We're still going to make half square triangles. We're just going to make smaller ones. And where this gets a little bit tricky is after you've pressed and after you've sewn everything together, you're going to see that you have quite a bit of bulk where these 4 half square triangles come together. So we're going to talk about that just a little bit, and we're going to talk about how we end up with perfect points when we sew those together. So this is our block number 2, and of course that was what we made in block number 1. All right, and my colors, again, I'm doing something a little bit different. This is the primary kit. What we're working on is the more classic traditional kit. And if you have all of your pre-cutting done, you'll just find that little bag, pull out all of those squares, and you should have just a whole bunch of mixed greens that are in here. You're going to do basically the same thing that we did last week. You're going to go ahead and grab a couple of different greens, just 2 that you feel are opposite. So just they could be different textures. One can be a dark and a medium, one could be a medium and a light, whatever you'd like. And you're just going to stack them right sides together. So whatever that looks like to you, just go ahead and grab these. I'm going to do it just for a second and get these all arranged. And what's kind of nice is that if I do them all first, then I know what I've ended up with and what I need to do some swapping. All right, you can see that I have a couple of extra squares. I tend to do that. I think when we talked in the first class, I talked about making sure you have insurance fabric. I also tend to have insurance blocks. If I'm cutting the whole strip, usually I'll just cut a couple extras anyway. That way, if I go to start mixing, I have a little more to choose from, or if I piece together a block and the whole thing ends up just whack-a-doodle and I'm not going to be able to use it, I can start over with something. So that's what I tend to do, but whatever works good for you. So here are my 12 pairs. These are my leftovers. I'm going to go ahead and put them right back in the bag so that later on I know what they are. And now I'm going to piece these into half square triangles. I'm going to do the exact same thing that we did in the first class. So I'm just going to line these up together, and I'm going to grab my quick quarter ruler, or again, if you don't have this, you could do the same thing with your little ruler. You're just going to line it up. I'll show you what the difference is. So for this one, we lined that up and we drew the line inside and then on both sides, and everything was marked. If we don't use that, what I'm going to do is line this up right from point to point. And I'll either go right to the sewing machine and just make sure that I'm sewing 1/4 of an inch down one side and 1/4 of an inch down the other, or I can add an extra line. And if I add an extra line, I'm just going to line up my ruler so that I'm 1/4 of an inch from that line to the edge, and I can draw my second line. So you can see that this one takes a little bit more time to go ahead and mark it, or a little bit more attention if what you're going to do is just mark it once and then do your 1/4 of an inch past. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew all of these. Okay, before we start sewing, I just want to show you a couple things in terms of notions. So this is the 1/4 inch foot that I tend to use for my FOF machine. Yours might look very different depending upon what machine you sew on, but you can see that it has like a little blade, and you'll see how that works, where what I'm doing is I'll either run it alongside the fabric so that I'm exactly a 1/4 of an inch over, or in this case where we're sewing half square triangles, since I decided just to draw one line and not mark that, I'm going to run that right along that line. So I'm sewing a 1/4 of an inch on both sides. Your 1/4 inch foot might look something like that, or it might be something where it just has a little blade edge. But you want to make sure that you don't assume. Don't assume that this one is your 1/4 inch foot and it's, you know, that line or whatever. Make sure that you know, and make sure that you test it so that whatever foot you're using is an accurate 1/4 inch, because if it's not, then your blocks are not going to come out the right size and you'll have to make some adjustments. So the other thing I want to talk to you about is pinning. If you fuss with everything and you have your blocks right sides together and it's time to sew, it is nice to kind of pin everything in place. When we use quilter pins, you can see that quilters pins are at least 1 1/4 inch long, if not 1.5 inches. The reason for that is that they are nice and visible. They don't create any kind of a distortion when you pin it, but when you are sewing, as you get close to that, you're going to go ahead and pull that pin out. Your other option is to use a binder clip, or I think they're called Wonder clips, but I like them. They're really nice. They end up holding things together. You don't have to necessarily move it. You can sew around and you're not pulling anything out. So either way, whichever you prefer, but it is nice to kind of keep things together. All right, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and, again, what I did is I just drew one line, so I'm going to be very careful to make sure that I'm sewing a 1/4 of an inch down that side and a 1/4 of an inch down this side. And while I do it, I'm going to end up chain piecing, which means that as soon as I'm done with one, I'm going to butt the next one right up next to it and sew again. But the next one right up next to it, and then I'm going to come up around and I'm going to keep sewing up the other side so I can get a bunch of them sewn all at once. Okay, a couple things I want to mention. One is that when I'm sewing on a FOF, what happens is whenever I stop on this particular model, the needle will stop in the down position, and I don't know if you noticed, but my presser foot will slightly lift, which gives me that opportunity to fuss with things. The other thing is it might have looked like I was sewing over the top of the blocks, but what happened is I was sewing here, and even though these were overlapped, I stopped sewing there, and it was a good 1/2 inch before I started sewing again. So now I'm going to go back over. I'm going to do this all again until I've sewn all of my pairs together, and then I'm going to clip all of these apart, cut these apart, and do some pressing. So we'll meet back on the other side. Okay, I thought maybe we would do that together. So you might have one of those fancy little chain cutting tools, or you're just going to go ahead and take your scissors, cut off those little chain piecing pieces. And again, you can go ahead and cut this with your scissors if you prefer to. It's not going to matter, because again, what you're cutting, this is all in your seam allowance. So we oftentimes talk about cutting accurately, and it is important to cut accurately, but at this point, all you're doing is cutting those two apart. But for me, I find it's a little bit easier to use my rotary cutter, so I'm going to cut them apart that way. So I'll cut apart just these few that we have pieced, and then we're going to do our pressing. And our pressing is the exact same thing that we did in last class. We're just going to set the seam in all of them, just to make sure that everything is nice and flat. So see how there's just a little bit of a ripple there? And so if I were to open this up and start pressing, it wouldn't necessarily be wrong. It could be that we're going to get everything nice and flat and right where it needs to go. But generally, it's a whole lot easier if you start with something that's nice and flat and all of those stitches are right where they need to be. That way, when it comes time to open them up, you don't have anything that's going to be a surprise. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get all of these sewn, cut apart, and pressed open, and then we'll be right back. All right, so we've pressed all of these, and I just want to mention, just like in the second class with the first block when we did the large half square triangles, you also want to make sure that you cut off those little dog ears. And it's extremely important with this particular block because there's a whole lot of fabrics that are coming together, and you want to make sure that you don't have all of that bulk. So you'll trim all of those off, throw all of those away, and then let's just measure your block. Your block should be 2.5 inches, and it is 2.5 inches all the way around. That should be what it comes out to. If it's not, and if you're not sure about that, maybe measure it before you start sewing, just to make sure that everything is okay. If what you have to do is trim a little bit off, that would be fantastic. If it's too small though, it's going to be nothing but a problem because all of these blocks have to fit together. So that's again why it's extremely important to make sure that you have cut properly and that you have a complete 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now this block, for some reason, is just a smudge. So if you can close up in here, you can see this is a little bit extra. There's just about a thread's width extra here. And do you see this line? That's that 2.5 inch mark. So I am probably a 1/16 of an inch over. The truth is I probably would let that go a little bit, but I'm just going to show you if you were going to square this up, what you'd want to do is make sure that you have your ruler has a 45-degree mark on it so that we know that that's going right through the center, because you don't want to take more off of one side than another. You want to make sure that your block still remains an equal. So yeah, you can see it's really just shards of fabric that we're cutting off there. I'm going to turn that around. We've lined it up right here. You can see this is hardly worth cutting, but just to show you. Oops. That's what we cut off. And that should be about right. It really should end up being 2.5 inches. So once it's 2.5 inches, you're just going to choose which 4 blocks you want to sew together. Again, don't give it just a ton of thought. Once you have all of your pieces sewn together, you'll have a whole bunch to choose from. And you might decide that you want every single triangle to be a different color. Or if we look at our quilt for just a second, you can see that sometimes for triangle tiles, I went ahead and made them all different, and sometimes I made them all the same. So it's not really going to matter. You can mix it up however you'd like to. But now what's going to happen is I'm going to sew these two together, and then I'm going to sew these two together, press them open, and then I'm going to sew the top seam. Now, sometimes you might hear a term called a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And it's kind of a funny thing because we talk and talk and talk about the fact that your seam allowance has to be a 1/4 inch or else the math won't work out. Well, sometimes what happens is that you have to take into account that there's this little bit of a roll that happens when you press that open, and when you have multiple seams that are coming together, when it presses open, you just have that little bit of extra that's in there. And so it just doesn't, you can't get the whole thing flat enough to make up the difference. So what we do is a scant 1/4 inch is like a needle's width thinner. And so that's what we're going to end up doing, is just a tiny little bit. And I'm going to show you on the sewing machine. I'm going to sew this one together, and then I'm going to sew this seam. Okay, so I'm going to lay this together. Pin it if you'd like to, or I'm going to come up so you can see that a 1/4 inch seam allowance would be, I'm going to get something so I can point for you. 1/4 inch seam allowance, you can see that I'm right on that edge right there. So what I'm actually going to do is come over, and it's really just about a needle's width. So it's just a scant 1/4 inch. So, I guess I should, I don't know where I started sewing there. So I don't know if you can see how close I am, but the lead of the pencil is about right. I'm going to stop, do my next one, and I'm still going to chain piece. I'm going to butt that right up against it. And again, are you able to see? I'm not quite, that would be a 1/4 inch. And I'm doing a scant 1/4 inch, so just a little bit smaller. And then what I'm going to do, and the reason that it's important, let's look at this for just a second. I'm just going to finger press this. Do you see that distance right there? That should be a 1/4 inch, because as soon as I sew that seam, you can see that that's why this point is going to come out exactly right. And that's where all of this bulk, by the time we're pressing this one open, this one over, this one over, this one back, that's why we need just a little bit smaller seam allowance to account for all of the bulk that's in that seam. So I'm going to open this one up also. I'm just going to finger press it. And finger press it just means that I'm going to do it right here at the sewing machine instead of getting up, walking over to the iron, pressing it, and coming back. So again, on this one, you can see that distance, that 1/4 inch seam allowance. So it's going to end up right there. So this one, you can see I finger pressed to that direction. This one, I finger pressed it to the other direction. I've made sure that that seam is absolutely open, because then when I put this together, that's what causes our seams to nestle. So see, this one is going this way, this one is going that way, and it just locks right into place right there. And so then normally what I do is I'll go ahead and take my Wonder Clip and clip that together. And what's kind of nice is that if I clip that together, there's actually a little line I'm not sure if it shows up in the camera or not, but there's a little line right there that shows right where my 1/4 inch is, because as I'm coming up to it, I can see that I'm going to hit right through that intersection. And if I flip it over on the other side, you can see the same thing. Oh, and there you see actually that line. You can see right where I'm going to end up sewing. So I'm going to put this down. I have my points together. Okay. And so I'm still going to go ahead and do my scant 1/4 inch. And where we're doing that is whenever we have a lot of bulk in those seams, just to make sure that everything presses. Otherwise, people will say, well, my goodness, I know that I cut properly. I know that it's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but for some reason, my block came out too small. And it's just because you're not doing anything wrong. It's just that when you try to press that, what you'll see is that all of that bulk doesn't allow you to lay perfectly flat. All right, we're going to go over and press it, but let's see how we did. And there we go. So again, all of that, so we've got that perfect point, and again, there's all of that bulk that's in there, and that's why we have that scant seam allowance. We're going to press it and look up close. All right, so let's look at this block for a second. So it looks like this right off of the sewing machine, and people will ask all the time, do you press from the back or do you press from the front? I start at the back just to make sure that things lay where I want them to lay. And I tend to add my best press, which I've put into my mister, but I'm going to go ahead and put my seams down where they go. And then if you'd like to, you could press your seams open. I tend not to, and the reason that I don't is because, in my opinion, if you press your seam open, the only thing between your batting and the outside world is that thread right there that was used to sew that seam. And so for me, I just think that I have a little bit more stability with my quilt if I lay it over. But the people that do like them open, it's because of all of that bulk right there. So there is something called a clipping trick, and I'm going to show you up close. It's for those of us that we don't want all of that bulk, because if I fold that over, let's count. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There would be 8 layers of fabric right there. And so if you are machine quilting it, you're going to feel that. So what you can do is you can come in, and I'm just going to clip right up to that seam allowance on both sides. That way what I can do, I'm just going to clip that seam right there. That was just my little nestling seam. That way what can happen is this can be open, but this can be over, and maybe even this one I want to be over that way. I can make any decision I want to and leave that open. So I'll show you what that will look like. And again, maybe that'll be over. So see, you have this weird little seam that lays flat right there. And again, depending upon where you cut, that could be different depending upon what you like. Once I have my seams organized where I'd like them, and you can see that there's a huge difference there, because then I don't have 8 layers of fabric anywhere. It's all been dispersed. Then I can go ahead and flip it over, and I can finish pressing it all the way. And again, you can see that I have perfect points right in the center here. And now what we'll do is see if we need to square up our block. our block should end up being 4.5, but usually since we're doing that scant 1/4 inch in the center, we can just trim off just a few little extra shards that are all the way around. And sure enough, I'm going to make sure that at 4.5, half of 4.5 is 2 1/4. And so my 2 1/4 mark is 1, 2 1/4 is going to be right here. And I'm going to go ahead and mark it. Put it here so you can see it. 1, 2 1/4. 2 1/4. Right there. Do you see that? 1, 2 1/4. So this is the center of my block. So I'm going to line that up right in the center. And I can see that my 45-inch mark degree is right down the center right there. And I can also see that there's a, just past my 4.5, I can see that there's a tiny little bit that I can trim off, tiny little bit that I can trim off, tiny little bit all the way around, which is going to help to make my block perfectly square, the exact size with perfect points. So I'm going to put firm pressure, and I'm going to cut along the side. Make sure that I've made my cut before I move my ruler, and I'm just going to turn and cut across the top. Make sure I've made my cut before I remove my ruler. Spin this around because those two sides were the sides I just cut. Line that up right on my 4.5, right on my 4.5. That dot is still right in the center. I have my 45-degree line going right through there. Firm pressure, double check, and then trim off the side. Make sure I've made my cut before I move my ruler. Cut across the top. Make sure I've made my cut. And there you have it. Here is my fairly perfect, not that that matters, but my nice little triangle tiles block. So my triangle tiles block, a lot of mixed greens because that's what you're going to see in the background of your tree. And I think, let me just double check, I think that we're making 6. We're making 6 of these blocks. Not too many. Once you've made these blocks, you're going to put them right back in your little bag that's marked block 2, maybe with your little extras. Maybe you'll need those extras, hopefully you won't. Put all 6 of them in there, put these aside, and we'll see you next week for block number 3.
Thank you for watching our video. We invite you to leave a comment, hit the like button, or better yet, subscribe to our channel so you never miss an episode. You can also visit our Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, or Pinterest pages, or find all of those things and our online store at fabricpatch.net.